All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Heather Metcalf and am Chief Research Officer for the Association for Women in Science, also known as AWIS. And I am the PI for the Advanced Resource and Coordination Network, also known as the ARC Network. Thank you all for registering for this town hall on ensuring equity in institutional COVID-19 responses. We'll spend some time at the beginning here setting some context and establishing ground rules for our conversation today. As a brief note, everyone is currently on mute and we're providing open captioning today that we'll get started here. I'll share a few more housekeeping notes here in just a little bit, but first I wanted to start with a brief introduction to the ARC Network to familiarize those of you who have not connected with us before. Next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. We do this through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholars program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. We'd like to take a moment to thank members in our community at the beginning here, including Gretel Leibniz and the AIM Network for coordinating weekly virtual coffee and tea hours for folks to connect, share challenges, and problem solve together as we continue to navigate the impact of COVID-19. Thank you to all of our communities that practice in attendance today, including AWIS. To share welcoming remarks on behalf of AWIS is AWIS CEO Sandy Robert.
Greetings, everyone. I want to add my thank you for your participation to Heather's opening remarks. It has been our long service pleasure to both host advanced grant programs and now the ARC grant, which is such a culmination of coming on 20 years of history of advanced coordination, as many of you are aware. Many of you have participated over many years of that. I would like to say that this is a somber time for many of us in facing a global pandemic, the likes of which we've never seen in our lifetimes. And it is even more crucial during this time for us to look at ways that we can share information about how each of us is navigating a territory that's very new to us. Many people are experiencing Zoom calls, 8 or 9 of them a day, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your time with us today to learn and engage more. At AWIS, in addition to serving as the backbone organization for the ARC Network, in response to COVID, we are extending memberships to those who have been members with us and have been adding Zoom resources to the chapters so that they can engage at the community and regional level free of charge if they don't have that capability. And we're also making a number of Career Center enhancements, recognizing that now is a time when many people can be in transition. And our chapter network is also very busy doing a number of Zoom and virtual meetings, and more information about that can be found on our website. I just wanted to take a time to thank you for participating and to recognize the collaboration that AWIS and ARC have enjoyed for many years, and look forward to the path ahead. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sandy. I wanted to mention that the ARC Network centers our values on intentionality, intersectionality, and inclusivity, the 3 I's framework. As such, it's important to share some background on the impetus for this town hall as we get started. Each of the team members pictured here played an important role in shaping these remarks on behalf of the ARC Network, which were also guided by perspectives shared by members across the ARC Network community and advanced communities.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Page, Dr. Stephanie Page. I am the new Community Engagement Manager for ARC Network. And I just want to take a moment to give you a brief overview of the impetus for this town hall today. One of the simplest definitions of inequity calls it lack of justice. Inequity takes many different forms and includes contexts of race, ethnicity, gender identity, disability, sexuality, and so much more. That is before we think of how each of these contexts intertwine in complicated ways to shape experiences, opportunities, and oppression. Because of this, we know that there is no gender equity without simultaneously facing all dimensions of oppression. In our work on gender equity, we know all too well that those living with additional dimensions of systemic marginalization are often diminished, if not made invisible, by our approaches. We know that despite the best intentions, those most empowered in the decision-making processes at our institutions do not reflect those most impacted by injustice. In times of crisis, the distance from the varied lived experiences of inequity necessitates external push and support in ensuring equity is integrated in decision-making processes. We are here today in the midst of many crises, including a global pandemic, to coalesce community, reflecting the lived experiences and the scholarship around inequity in the academy to ensure the integration of equity in institutional responses to COVID-19. We already see the impacts of inequity when we look at local populations who are most at risk of critical illness and mortality due to novel coronavirus. Inequity has been revealed in other predictable ways as we look at the disproportionate negative impacts on women around traditional metrics of faculty success, such as publications. We are seeing historically under-resourced institutions fall into even greater precarity and less protection, despite their being critical to educational equity. Faculty and entire departments whose research and mission focus on racial, ethnic, women, and gender studies are finding themselves deprioritized, even disinherited by their larger institutions. This is happening all while STEM departments receive additional funding and support as they seek solutions to the novel coronavirus. Without incorporating the knowledge from the humanities and social justice related fields, these solutions are likely to only perpetuate a long history of scientific sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, colonialism, and so much more. As an example, medical and pharma enterprises are already suggesting testing early coronavirus vaccines on poor communities and communities of color. We must also keep in mind those who make up the service and support staff at our institutions and on the front lines, who often reflect the populations most impacted by inequity in our society. In keeping with our values, it is important that we take moments to make some acknowledgements. To offer the first acknowledgement is Aspen Russell, Research Assistant with ARC and AWIS.
Thank you, Stephanie. We would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the very land that we are, that is beneath us as we begin this meeting. So I just want to start off by saying, while we're meeting together virtually in the context of this global pandemic, we must acknowledge that the majority of us are attending today's town hall from homes and workplaces that are located on Indigenous land. As land acknowledgements grow in popularity at academic convenings, it's important to remember that we occupy Indigenous land on a daily basis. Our land grant institutions, for example, are built on a foundation of expropriated Indigenous land. We're going to take a moment to honor with gratitude the land you're on itself and the people who lived and still live there and care for it at the end of this statement. After the town hall, take the time to learn about the history of the land you live and breathe on, the Indigenous peoples connected to it, and the impact that history has on current Native communities, particularly during this pandemic. Support Native communities who, because of the ongoing legacy of colonization, genocide, forced removal, ethnic cleansing, scientific experimentation, and stolen land, are disproportionately suffering as COVID-19 spreads. Learn about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement to end gendered violence against Native peoples. Deepen your understanding of how these issues impact the Native faculty, staff, and students at your colleges and universities, and serve as a well-informed ally, colleague, leader, mentor, teacher, and more. And now that we've heard this statement and we can ground ourselves for this conversation, let's take a moment, a pause, of the acknowledgement of the land that we're all sitting on.
As leaders of the ARC network, we also cannot enter into conversation about equity without also addressing the monumental global collective outcry against systemic racism, particularly anti-Blackness and police brutality, and reaffirm and amplify that Black lives matter. While we are witnessing, and some of us are participating in, large-scale protests, risking our own health amidst the global pandemic to condemn white supremacy and state-sanctioned violence, we must not lose sight that the struggle for racial equity has been ongoing for centuries and is embedded in our academic institutions and in STEM broadly. We must not lose sight that this violence disproportionately affects Black men and women and trans folks, including the faculty, staff, and students on our campuses. We must not lose sight that racism in its insidiousness and pervasiveness has been so deeply ingrained in US society and our collective psyche that many of its permutations have been rendered invisible. It is not enough to be non-racist. To achieve racial justice, we must all actively engage in anti-racist actions. The time is now. We cannot aspire to return to normal because its aspiration perpetuates Black death. We must want more and we must do more. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves on systemic racism and seek out actions we can take to promote racial justice. And there is a wealth of information available to engage in this work. After the town hall, we will be sharing these resources back out to the community. To recognize the over 100,000 lives lost to COVID-19 and the innumerous Black lives lost to police brutality and systemic injustice, please join us for a moment of quiet reflection. Thank you. There is no easy transition to describing the format of the town hall, but we hope this introduction has emphasized how critical equity is to decision-making, especially during times of crisis.
I just want to take a brief moment to align us with the primary goals of today's town hall. We seek to understand the top issues and challenges of gender equity among the faculty, which will shape the development of a webinar series designed to inform and educate higher education decision makers as they address the issues identified today. We hope to provide ARC Network resources, or we will provide, ARC Network resources, from connecting people to highlighting resources currently available in the online resource library on Mendeley, focused on systemic STEM equity. We also seek to identify exemplary practices, tools, policy approaches, advice emerging in response to COVID-19 to support women in STEM and gender equity work in higher education. Additionally, we hope to identify people with expertise and bandwidth to present in the webinar series we will host throughout the rest of the summer.
All right, now I'd like to go into a few housekeeping items as we move into the discussion part of our conversation today. On the technology side of things, as a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, I'd like to point out a couple of useful features for the app. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a microphone and video settings, including muting, unmuting, turning your video on and off, and other ways of controlling the source of your audio and video. These are located on the bottom left. In the bottom middle of the screen, there are menu options for Q&A, chat, raising your hand, and more. As I mentioned earlier, we're placing everyone on mute for now and ask that if you have any questions about Zoom or you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and we're happy to help sort those out with you. The chat is also going to serve as a space for discussions throughout this session, which I already see a few people chiming in there, so thank you. Please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak. We'll be providing speaking space to 1 or 2 speakers among the attendees during each of our discussion prompts. Because ongoing conversations about academic decision-making are often centered on predominantly white Research 1 institutions, we'll be balancing this discussion intentionally in a few ways. In the speaking opportunities throughout this session, we'll be prioritizing attendees who study or work at minority-serving institutions, those who experience multiple dimensions of marginalization, and those for whom speaking their perspectives provides greater accessibility than typing. We'll be using the Q&A in a different way today. Since we have almost 600 people registered for this town hall, and we want to hear from as many of you as we can, when we posed a question to you, we ask that you post your response in the Q&A. If another attendee's response resonates with you, please upvote it. After the town hall, we'll also be circulating a survey to provide additional opportunities for you to share feedback with us about both the town hall process and the experience that you have here today, and to offer additional commentary on the questions that we're going to pose as part of this discussion. I'd also like to share a few ground rules to shape our dialogue today. The ground rules that we'll be using today have been developed by the ARC Network community members over time, beginning with our inaugural stakeholder meeting and being expanded and refined through our emerging research workshops and biennial equity and STEM community convening. You can see the convening code of conduct on the ARC Network website should you wish to adopt a similar code for your own meetings. First, let's start with, when you're speaking, please introduce yourself briefly. Also aim for honesty, depth, and brevity so we can share the space with one another. Sharing your personal experiences is a valid and helpful way to contribute to the conversation. We also ask that you link them back to the systemic issues that we're addressing. We encourage you to listen for understanding. Limit your own assumptions and ask clarifying questions as needed. We also want to acknowledge that there'll be a range of emotions that come up in these conversations for us and for everyone in the audience. These are all valid. Be intentional with your actions in response to your own emotions and work to handle the emotions of others in the space with care. Please be respectful and open to others' ideas and build on them where you can. There may be times where you need to challenge what another participant is saying. In this case, please be sure to phrase your remarks so it's clear that you're challenging the view and not the person. Be aware if you're dominating the conversation and invite others to share in the conversational space in our chat. Because it's important to us to shape ground rules for conversation in a way that brings in perspectives across our community, we'd like to also have some space right here for any of you to share additions that you'd like to see to these ground rules before we jump into the prompts. You can place any suggestions that you have in the Q&A, and again, I encourage folks from our attendees to upvote any that they think are particularly important. So we'll pause for a moment to do that. All right, it looks like there aren't any suggestions. If you have any as we go along, feel free to add them. Oh, I see, we do have a few hand raised. All right, I'm gonna add a few folks to the panel so you can share your ideas here. Miyun?
Yes.
Hi, I saw you had your hand raised.
Oh, did I enter it? I'm sorry. I
Oh,
didn't
no, it's
mean to.
okay. It's okay. I will help
right.
and lower your hand for you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
While we're waiting, there was a question about what upvoting looks like.
Yep. So once a person posts a comment in the Q&A, there'll be a little box next to it that says upvote, and then you can do that. We currently have no one adding anything into the Q&A, so you won't be able to see the menu until someone else does that. It looks like no other hands. There we go. Thank you for posting an example. See how there's the little like hand that's there? Yep, lots of people trying it out. Great. Thank you for demonstrating, attendees. Perfect. All right. I think we're good to go on to the next part.
Okay.
Pass it over to you, Crystal.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will now address the topic at hand, starting with our first prompt for conversation today. As a reminder, we ask that you place your response in the Q&A, and we will be monitoring that and highlighting these responses. But how do we ensure that equity and the lessons learned from diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including NSF Advance, are centered in COVID-19 decision-making? Giving folks a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having difficulty seeing the Q&A. So if someone wants to speak too.
So we have one comment that says, ask the equity impact statements be prepared for each major decision point. And one upvote for that. Mm-hmm. Another that says, by not being afraid to keep bringing it to the attention of others and be the voice of the effort. Keep talking until heard, but offer ideas and solutions, not just problems. I also see another comment in the chat that says, make sure the group making decisions is inclusive.
And I think just to add to this, these comments are really great to also probe about if you're in a leadership position, whether if you're not in a leadership position, what does that look like and how has it changed for your position or the state of your university or your organization, right? We can dig into some of those more critical areas as well.
There's also a comment that we have the individuals with the knowledge of DEI work at the table when these decisions are made. We need those folks in the room and at the table.
Mm-hmm. Build relationships with university administrators.
Also comment about collecting information surveys and stuff about the people who are being affected to directly inform leadership, which is really fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if this particular comment might be worth bringing the individual in if they agree. it looks as if their office will be doing case studies, I guess tomorrow, to address directly with the chairs to address these equity issues. Just wondering if that person would be open to commenting briefly live.
Great.
She said yes.
Yep, I'm adding her
Okay, great.
now. Mhm.
Hi, this is Caroline Simpson from Florida International University. We're an HSI in Miami. For those of you that don't know about us, we are in the 4th year, just finished the 4th year of our 2nd advanced grant. We have had a lot of success in our bystander leadership intervention training that some of you may be familiar with, using case studies with faculty to help them explore tricky issues with things like evaluation, hiring, and a member of our team, Kirsten Wood, who runs a lot of our bystander trainings, has created 3 case studies that we're going to use at the chair's retreat tomorrow, which will be a long day of Zoom, centered on addressing such issues as research and teaching being impacted, especially, for example, with single parents with small children at home, out of school, things like that. Our faculty union also created 2 actually MOUs. I think I put the link in the Q&A, addressing issues about faculty evaluations in the time of COVID. It's not centered on equity and diversity per se. So our office has sort of taken that, and with these case studies is trying to refocus it on equity and diversity.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing.
And I also dropped the link. Thank you for sharing that. I dropped that in the link also for attendees who are unable to find it in the Q&A.
We have another comment that says, advocate at institutional leadership tables and sessions for objective assessment of contact tracing and other social monitoring tools in terms of the strong potential for the tools to be misused and/or drive social stigma. Mhm. I'm seeing a lot in here about different trainings that people are doing with departments and college personnel committees to make sure that equitable approaches to assess it are taken to assessing COVID impacts.
There appears to be a couple of comments peppering through in terms of, how to address where institutional leadership appears to be making decisions without input. Is there anyone in the attendees who would like to speak to that directly? Just because there are a number and they're getting upvoted, but I just want to make sure we give someone the option to speak to that.
Let's see, Mi-Yoon said that she could speak to the comment about leadership. So let me find her in here because her hand isn't raised right now.
Just as you're working through that, Heather, and I don't know how we'll kind of cross address, but someone is bringing up that as Q&A, as questions get upvoted, they kind of move and it's difficult for people to track. So there are questions in terms of what we'll provide in response. And we will provide a recording, but please also let us know if there are additional resources within the webinar that you would like to see or that you would find beneficial. And then we can include that in what we send out and make available. And also, because we will be continuing this conversation through different modes on our social media, primarily in Mendeley, please let us know if there's a particular question that you saw that you would like to see more conversation around, and we will definitely highlight that within our ongoing discussion.
Mm-hmm. I added Miyun back to the panelist space. Welcome back.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Mion Bruzniak, and I'm currently serving as a vice president of Seattle chapter of AWIS.
Mm-hmm.
And I am also a bioinformatics scientist working in Fred Hutch. It is a little bit, feel like a little bit late, but even though it's a little bit late, it's great that before even COVID-19, our institution started to have Office of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion for the first time after 45 years of history of this institution. And to make a long story short, I think it is wonderful that we have this kind of opportunity to check our knowledge about racism and what is the problem in the society, learning about issue and sharing that issue in any races are important fact. But one of the important discussion coming from our like 200 people meeting yesterday is importance of the representative is in the leadership. I'm talking about very top leadership, HR leadership, or the like CEO or CFO or CIO, those kind of level. The reason is it would be perfect society. The information has to be come out very fairly to everybody who is seeking for information. So that's why some institution is emphasizing the fact of transparency or those kind of things. However, that's ideas, that's ideas state. Mostly something that critical, for example, earlier we talked about some all of a sudden some grant or the philanthropy people coming and then had some kind of things they are looking for research kind of thing. Those information is not really always coming out synchronously. Means that if you know somebody or in the higher level, then you're gonna get that information like 2 weeks earlier than other people. So the thing is, it is not just a number game, but it's important to have leadership that has, especially the organization that doesn't have really a systematic process for having this kind of transparency very quickly. The more traditional institution they are, I think it is important to have representative who can both way collect information from the minority or woman and minority to go to the top, as well as any critical information can be also disseminated quickly to down so that you don't get this enhancement of asymmetry information dissemination that it actually contribute. It's, even though it's a small thing, but it will gonna be compounded continuously over time that creating inequity. That's what I was trying to say. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important, and we'll have a question here in a little bit about making sure that we have diversity of voices at the table and not just in a symbolic way. And I see this coming up a lot in the chat right now too, is like incorporating people who have lived experiences not in a tokenizing way. So I see Allison said, be intentional to avoid tokenizing Black and Indigenous people of color and creating diverse committees for decision making, and think outside. Oh, I see what you mean about the comment moving. Think outside hierarchies when identifying who has experience in your organization when developing these committees. Really making sure that the decision-making authority and that the power is distributed and not just symbolic gesture. So thank you for sharing that. I also see a bunch of comments here on making sure that information is shared transparently and not just within the highest level administrator, so that people know what's going on, so that they have the opportunity to provide feedback on that and to share their experiences, as well as tapping the work of faculty who study STEM equity issues.
And I'm wondering, Heather, if now is a good time to move to the next prompt, which really is, I mean, it's been well contextualized to this point, which is how do we do all of this in a way that accounts for intersectionality? And I saw a really good comment, and if that person is open to, if the individual is open to commenting publicly here, just saying to promote mechanisms to collect input and feedback from the community that seek to make sure all voices are heard. And so if that person wouldn't mind coming on and speaking more deeply, if you could just raise your hand, or if there were a couple of similar comments, but we really think that, you know, this is extremely valuable as a part of what we want to contribute in terms of resources. Okay, so I'm sorry I didn't see the individual. I hope that I didn't miss you. But again, like, just raise your hand at some point so we can find you. But if anyone else would like to again speak to how do we do this work of ensuring equity in a way that accounts for intersectionality and that is intentional about including the very complicated and very intertwined and multiplicative effects of living with various contexts of inequity.
I'm seeing a lot in here about collectivity and allyship and creating team approaches to help each other make sure that voices are being amplified.
I'm also seeing a comment that says, I'm seeing conversations within my disciplinary communities about the reticence many Black and Indigenous persons of color faculty, particularly women, have to acknowledge that there is an impact. They suggested that we really need to find a way to normalize. One solution to those campuses that have such groups is to invite those who are active allies to speak first. When dominant group members acknowledge the challenges, it makes it more normative to talk about these challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an exceptionally powerful message right now where so many people, even well-meaning people, are saying we need to return to normal. We just need to weather the storm. We just need to get through this. When what we really need to do is recognize what's been laid bare by these crises, these multiple crises, and move forward with that understanding of repairing and restoration. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much. And if you want to add more to the comment that you placed in the Q&A, please let us know.
I see also comment that says, I think a corollary to this question is how do we center intersectionality in ways that accounts for it without raising a diversity tax or inviting backlash toward those who are speaking up.
Also see another comment that says for intersectionality, stakeholder groups, such as women, faculty, minority faculty groups, should have these discussions themselves, I just lost it, to understand their members' experiences to make sure they are speaking for all voices within a group. And that's something that a comment that actually resonates with me, and I don't want to impose any additional meaning. But for me personally, this is very important in that we, those of us who occupy certain spaces and identities, we recognize that we're not monolithic and that we want to be inclusive of voices of individuals who share identity or lived experience. And so as we go and advocate, we want to recognize that there is a perspective beyond ourselves. But again, for any of these comments, if you wish to expand on them yourself, like just raise your hand and we'll get to you. Thank you. Great comment. Also partner with education, social science, and public health who are versed in equity issues to strengthen the conversation.
I'm seeing a number of questions coming back about how do we convince upper level administration or leadership that now is the time and the opportunity to change the status quo of inequity. So if anyone has any comments that they want to add around that, I think that is definitely connected to the question of how do we center intersectionality in all of this.
Yeah.
And getting leadership buy-in in that.
And so there was a comment in the Q&A saying to ask that equity impact statements be prepared for each major decision point. Wow, yes. And someone did also ask under that question whether there's anyone here whose institution is doing this and would be willing to say more about it. I just wanted to add a statement that I referred earlier. There was an additional comment that said, in reference to mechanisms for collecting input and feedback, they said to expand, these could look like town halls, listening sessions, office hours with administrators, stakeholder representatives at decision tables. But I should also add, it is very important to put teeth and accountability into these feedback collection sessions. I'm tired of going to town halls just to vent. I would like to get summarizing comments and responses. And then an additional comment to that was that, again, closing the loop is important on why recommendations were and were not acted upon. Okay, so we did have a hand raised. Can you see that, Heather?
Yep, I see Joya Misra. Let's bring you in here, Joya.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Joya.
Hi, it's so good to be in this space with all of you. I have my daughter has a recital in 14 minutes, so I'm gonna have to leave real quick, but just to give a sense of like how this is working for us is that we did the tenure delays, we did the sort of caregiving supports, we've tried to do a variety of things, but part of what's going to happen is that there'll be like an impact statement about how COVID has affected research and teaching and service and mentoring and you know, there's a real recognition that this can require so much more out of faculty at all these different stages. So not just like referring to what couldn't happen, but also all the additional things that did happen. And that'll be in the annual faculty report, but also in personal statements for tenure and promotion. And we just were in a session with our provost and some deans, and the faculty who were in that session seemed really enthusiastic about that. That notion that we can have like all of that going on. We're also working on creating some sort of trainings for personnel committees to make sure that they're following the guidelines that the provost and the union have put together about like not having people punished for the effect of COVID, but actually like, you know, really holding it. And so we'll be trying to make sure that our colleagues all recognize that in the way that they assess faculty. And then we'll also put things into the letters that go out to external reviewers to remind them of the importance of these effects and that they are real.
Thank you, Joya. I think that's so important. You know, I know that some institutions are thinking through this, and without connecting it to how you're calibrating expectations for the reviewers in the promotion and tenure process, then, you know, extending the tenure clock or certain opt-in, opt-out policies may not be able to actually mitigate the effects, the differential effects that these are having on faculty members, unless we're also thinking about each step in the process and in creating a different normal for everyone who's involved in making the evaluation decisions along the way. So that's really important. Thank you for sharing what you were doing.
And I want to, so there's another comment that I would like to highlight, and if the individual would like to speak, like definitely raise your hand so we can bring you in. The comment says, we sometimes make the assumption that creating equity for one minoritized group will create equity for all, and it does not help. But if we don't acknowledge intersectionality and discuss it, that won't be true. We must include individuals from historically minoritized groups in decision making and reward them in terms of tenure and promotion for the extra labor we are asking of them.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely, if you would like to expand on that, raise your hand so we can see you. And I think we've got that, Heather. Can you see it?
Yep, I added her in.
Great.
Hi.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Shepard. I'm a professor at Auburn University. And I think my point there is something I'm learning from my friends and colleagues who do represent multiple groups, because they get asked to do everything. They also mentor the students, especially I'm on a very white, heteronormative campus. And so anyone who has any sort of intersectionality ends up mentoring the few students we have. Even if they're not their advisor, then they're asked to be on every committee because we want representation on every committee. And then they're doing all this service that takes away from their other duties. And so we need to have formal mechanisms that recognize that service and that effort and even rewards it moving forward.
Absolutely, thank you.
I see another comment that's getting some movement. Our faculty with minoritized identities are very few. We want to account for their experiences without putting them on display, such as public forums. What are some other ideas for hearing from them? And this is very much related to our last prompt, but also great for the conversation around intersectionality and what it could mean to put someone, quote unquote, on Front Street, right? To publicly have them, make themselves expose, who they are in order to offer commentary and suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
So also, again, we have time for a couple of more people if you would like to openly and publicly comment as part of the town hall before we move to our third prompt.
And I'm curious if we have anyone in the audience who's at a community college or an HBCU or a tribal college or university who'd like to share how some of this is playing out on their campuses, just because, as we mentioned earlier, so much of the visibility around this and the few conversations that are happening about equity and decision making are really centered around predominantly white institutions. And just like we were talking about making sure that all voices are heard within a single campus, we also want to make sure that across campuses that we're hearing a variety of different experiences. So if anyone feels like they have an experience that they'd like to share and the bandwidth to do that, I encourage you to raise your hand so we can give you the mic.
One of the Q&As that stuck out to me as well was Margaret asking about if you have advanced at your institution, whether it's a center or whether you are yourself or your team are covered underneath an advanced grant. Is your institution seeking you out? If not, were you able to join in these efforts and provide your expertise? If they did reach out to you, what did that process look like? So the folks that aren't being reached out, maybe we can leverage that work. Or if you're in a senior leadership position, how did that come to be with this advanced work? We would love to know specifically how our advanced community can be involved or better involved in these efforts. So if you are one of those folks, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Mm-hmm. As we're leaving space for that, I'll note that one of our virtual visiting scholars added a comment about their advanced geo project, saying that their website's going to be updated soon with resources in 2 new sections. One of the sections is inclusivity and safety in virtual spaces. I did see a few comments popping up about how to create online learning environments for students, but also about how do we create spaces that are inclusive, that feel safe and respectful when we're having back-to-back Zoom meetings and all of these online, the online ways of creating work. So I think that's really important. She also mentioned that the other resource section is power dynamics and discrimination in the time of COVID-19, and that they've been collecting materials that lots of other amazing folks have developed, and they're trying to just gather them in a place so they can help distribute it and amplify that. So if anyone is interested, check that out at Advanced Geo. They do a lot of really great work.
We're going to do a little bit of house cleaning around our Q&A. We are still collecting all of the comments that are in the Q&A section. So don't worry if you see your comment look like it's disappearing. We are still collecting all of these, and we will, once we get everything together at the end and get it all organized, we'll definitely provide opportunities to see the questions. I did want to highlight, which might be an opportunity for additional conversation, and we can support that happening, that someone asked about in the chat. Could you guys share your specific activities that worked well, ensuring students feeling included in a remote classroom, or a paper about this? I've marked that question, and we'll definitely come back around and support you getting information on that for your students, and also for making any resource we pull together available to the attendees today. Thank you for asking that.
I'm also seeing a variety of comments that have been scattered in here about the intersections of caregiving responsibilities with balancing everything that's happening with COVID right now and the move to virtual environments for universities, and the need to pay attention to workload issues in this particular environment, and how that's going to affect productivity and the ways that we're thinking about and evaluating productivity. And to consider that as we're doing creative scheduling here, because we are in virtual environments. So I appreciate that comment. We also saw a comment about the intersections of gender and disability and ageism, and how that's been exacerbated in discussions about COVID-19 risk. I think those are really important to note and pay attention to here.
We also received another comment through the chat. And also, I just want to point out, when you're looking at your chat box and you're about to type your question, there's kind of a blue, it's 2 colon and then a blue rectangle. You can click on the little arrow there, and that will allow you to actually post your chat comment so that all panelists and attendees can see your comment. That's just an option I want to make sure that people are aware is there. So one comment that we had says, what will happen as budgets remain tight because of the COVID-19 situation? What support for underserved individuals will be put at risk? Everyone almost is in survival mode. What will be considered essential? Poor people do not come back at the same rate as others, I think, and this is that question, the person asking the question, is there anything we can do about this? And this is a great question for us to think about, and part of the impetus for the town hall today and some of what we want to address in terms of providing resources. And again, with the webinar series, to represent just a concentrated focus on these issues and challenges. And so, you know, it's really important that we are continuing to hear from a community beyond just our team. So thank you so much for sharing that. Another one that came up, what is the productive way to make the leadership in strongly traditional white universities accountable for their support for racial behavior and inequity from white senior faculty? Another really great question. If you wish to address either of those, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you in. Oh, and also, I did want to highlight directly, Heather, to your request, the comment regarding sort of the, and you know, universities being, everyone being in survival mode, that did come from a community college retired faculty member. So thank you very much.
All right, I think you can still respond to all these questions that we're posing. They're obviously very complex, and we want the time for our Q&A and our chat to develop, and we will identify them. I just want to give some space to open up a new question, and then to talk about it, because we've already started this. I mean, with this audience, it's unsurprising, but how do we ensure that we have a diversity of voices at the decision-making table and ensure that these voices are heard? I've already seen multiple times taking notes about information transparency, not only senior leadership, presidents, vice presidents, provosts, but also faculty at all levels, as well as grad students, as well as students. So how do we have that information transparency? Also, Allison's fantastic point about, when leadership bring folks of color specifically to the table, the tokenizing nature of it, but also in the wave of these protests and police brutality, a lot of senior leadership that are predominantly white are also using these folks to assuage their shame and guilt about the issues that are happening, right? How do we avoid that? How do we become great allies as well from the folks who are in leadership positions, who are on these Zoom calls? When we're going through technology, how does our allyship change to support our colleagues, not only morally, but also so that we can make the best decisions for our universities, for our organizations moving forward. So just to reiterate, how do we become more than a seat at the table? How do we balance diversity as well as inclusion?
as you're pondering that question, I see that we have a comment from one of our attendees. Let's see. It says that they're the director of the Office of Equal Opportunity at an Indigenous serving institution and serve as a quantitative analysis on the system advanced grant. This attendee says, I've been able to use my institutional and legal knowledge combined with the results of our research to better address identified needs, create solutions, and when necessary, provide the compliance nudge to encourage administration to support. We've also been able to raise a lot of awareness around rights in the workplace and in the educational setting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd love to hear more about that. I know you posted this anonymously. If you happen to feel comfortable speaking, I'd love to share the floor with you. If you want to let me know. If not, that's also perfectly okay. I think that the point that you're raising here about combining institutional knowledge with your field of expertise here and the research that you have to advocate for change and to use the structures that are in place in the institution to hold people accountable. I think that's a really powerful point. It looks like we do have one hand raised here. I'm going to bring you into the panel.
Hi, so much. Thank you so much for having me join today. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for an amazing session. But just to get quickly to my point, one of the main concerns in terms of having voices heard in terms of decision making and just being inclusive at the table, so to speak, is that many times when diversity is brought to the table, it is limited maybe to one person, say one person who identifies as Black or one person who identifies as gay, and then it becomes, you know, that person versus the world, so to speak. And it's so very important for be it boards, committees, organizations to recognize that you can't just have one person at the table and you say that we have diversity, because it creates an instantaneous block, so to speak, in terms of having substantive discussions and having that individual feeling comfortable and empowered to speak up and feel supported as well. So I think that's one thing which is very essential in terms of ensuring not only that the diversity and the voice are at the table, but that these voices are heard, are included, they're empowered, and that they're valued. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, you can't ask one person to speak on behalf of their entire social group. That's not how this works. It's too much to expect of anyone, and also it totally disregards the diversity of experiences and perspectives that happen within a social group, and that's the whole point the intersectionality is trying to make. It's more complicated than that. So thank you for raising that. That's really, really important.
Along these lines, there's a comment in the chat that says, I am concerned about the voice of DEI being fully invested institutionally in the DEI officer or office. Whether they are great and knowledgeable or not, I have seen this institutionalization actually quiet the conversation about DEI on campuses. This includes the idea of professionalization and diversity. If you would like to speak to that here publicly, could you raise your hand? And it's perfectly okay if not. That is a great comment, and we would love to hear more. And as we're sort of keeping an eye out for individuals who are having, who would like to speak, I do want to say that many people are saying in the chat that they have to leave early. We thank you so much for being here, and we completely understand that there's so much happening all at once, and we thank you for attending and contributing, and just keep an eye out as we continue to share out the resources. And also this is recorded and you'll get that too, and really offer, hopefully you'll offer us your feedback so that we can continue to develop tangible resources as we all go out and continue to do this work. And again, thank you so much for attending.
Looks like we have someone who would like to speak, so I'm going to move them to the panelist space.
Okay.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this session. It's been extremely informative, and I really appreciated at the beginning you taking those moments for us to pause and reflect. I think that's really important given all the circumstances that we're living through. So thank you for that as well. And my name is Ian Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director for the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium. And just thinking with my kind of recruitment hat on, when we talk about decision-making and being at the table, I think, you know, we've got to take that analogy a step further. We kind of have to get people in the house to begin with so they can get to the table. And so I just really think it's important that institutions are thinking really critically about their diverse recruitment efforts, their equitable hiring practices. And then once they are able to increase diversity in their institution, then really focusing on pipelines and training programs to elevate candidates of diversity who enter the university system and then become faculty or staff, whatever the case may be, giving them the opportunity to advance in their careers. And I also really believe strongly that having a seat at the table doesn't mean that you have to be in an elevated leadership position. When I was at a university, I really took the tactic often of bringing people from my team who were the experts to the table so that they could have a chance to speak and really be more convincing than me regarding whatever topic we might have been discussing. And I think that's very critical in the diversity sphere as well. And, you know, I will comment on the comment that you brought up about the DEI office. I think there's a lot of merit to that. We work closely, we partner with NADAHE, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. And I believe there was a stat, I don't want to get this exactly right, but that the average tenure of a diversity, equity, inclusion officer now is about 3 years. And I think there's a connection between that statistic and the comment, because I feel like there's probably the pressure on the diversity office as well. If it feels like, okay, we've got this, now we're going to centralize all of these efforts and we've got this covered, and they're not maybe seeing the support that they need and the incorporation of the rest of the university community within the diversity projects that are going on. So I just thought I'd make that connection, but thank you very much for allowing me to contribute.
Thank you, Ian.
We also see another comment, I'm sorry, in the chat.
Go ahead, Crystal.
Thanks. I can see the chat. That I think gives us some additional complexity to thinking through the role of diversity officers. And the attendee says, under COVID-19 financial pressures, which we've touched on a little bit and seen in the Q&A and chat, there may be a tendency to have interim leadership be appointed, and risk and there's concern around the risk to status quo continuing. And I think this piggybacks on Ian's comment, and when we think about turnover in these positions and the continued sharing of the knowledge and best practices and lessons learned, how do we ensure that that is happening as people take on roles that they are in temporarily or for short periods of time?
Absolutely. And I think this set of comments here about recruitment, about existing culture, about diversity, equity, and inclusion officers all drive home the point that a lot of times we try to position these efforts as something that happens in this like space that's over here, rather than fully integrating it into the fabric of our institutions. And I think recruitment efforts as well as retention efforts kind of have to be interwoven, as well as having diversity, equity, and inclusion being a part of everything that we do, and not just something that gets siloed into an office and one person is suddenly responsible for handling all of this for a campus. So I really appreciate all of these comments that are coming in here.
And I wanted to point out, because I actually think it's the same commentary. And so if you feel comfortable at all speaking today, there's another really great comment saying, for campuses that are unionized, and we're also negotiating contracts during this time, it's essential that consideration of DEI promoting practices be considered during contract negotiations, as this can have a very lasting impact. It's even easier to miss these opportunities in the COVID climate. Those of us on these negotiating teams need to remember to keep bringing this up so that lasting language that is not helpful does not get addressed or prevented.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a lot of people dropping some resources in the chat too. So one comment that I'll make is we'll be gathering all of these and putting them into a single location to share back out to everyone. We'll also, as I mentioned earlier, be sharing out a survey after this, where if you think of something later that was a really great resource for you, you can upload it as part of that survey. And what we'll do is put it all together in one space and share it back out, and it can be a dynamic, growing set of resources that we have. So thank you to everyone who's sharing that in there. One of the resources that I see mentioned is academicequity.com, which is a website containing supporting information to an op-ed that's being published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences about ensuring gender equity in academia in the wake of COVID-19, which is really great. I'm glad that you're sharing this, and we look forward to reading that op-ed and sharing it back out to the community.
I also want to highlight a new comment in the chat. The issue with with a decision-making table is that it'll always have limited capacity. Institutions must work to empower every person in their communities. Also, every person should engage with each other with expectation of something valuable transpiring, regardless of where you happen to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Heather was saying. Members of ARC who also receive access to our Mendeley online library may or may not know that this is also serving as a social media site. So we are able to continue to engage and have conversations. And what we'll do over the, throughout the webinar series and over the coming days is actually put some of these comments, utilize some of these comments and questions to form prompts for continued discussion there. And I think there's a lot to be shared in terms of resources. And again, I'm really thankful for everyone who is sharing their insights and their resources here today.
Mm-hmm. I have one comment from an attendee who has to leave earlier, who's an advanced director and D&I officer in an HBCU. And this attendee mentions that they have not yet been asked to the table during their university's decision-making after COVID-19, and saying that the things that all of you who are attending have been sharing and the discussions that we're having here are providing a lot of insight into how they can make sure equitable decisions are being made, especially for women among the faculty. So already it's providing helpful input of the things that you're sharing to help people strategize how they might be able to get equity centered a bit more within their organizational decision making. Just looking through some of the things in the chat here. There's a comment that says small advisory groups could be useful, but they often tend to become boxes that administrators check off. There needs to be agreement between and across groups that they will be listened to and ideas vetted and incorporated. The checkbox piece, I think, really connects back into the conversation that we were having earlier about tokenizing folks who are invited into decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment that I'm hearing is so many times in response to voicing our feelings of being ignored, our institutional leadership will say, I heard you, but we decided to go in another direction. How can we make sure that we are actually heard? Is it unreasonable to hear rationale why the recommendations made by stakeholders are the wrong direction?
I want to point out this comment because I really think that it takes into account the weight of being in the position to push for equity or to do equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion service on a campus. It says, it is really important to be gracious toward colleagues who are contributing so much to DEI service on campus when they ask for a break or need to step away to engage in their scholarship. It is really important to support the individuals who do this work and bear this burden, and who oftentimes do it in addition to and not as a part of their tenure and promotion, because it's oftentimes not valued as a part of tenure and promotion. So I just wanted to point that out, because we're really also thinking about how do we keep the people who do this work supported, and ensure that they remain intact, full human beings, and that they understand their value, not just to their smaller communities, but to the broader work of equity in the academy.
Building off of that, a lot of you are talking about this is the time where there's, yes, a lot of turnover, but also with the unionizing talk in contracts, but also assessment and evaluation of assistant professors in tenure cases. These are the times where allyship, stepping up and making sure these points are involved to where that this type of work can be codified into a system that is rewarded, and that, you know, they don't take a hit to their scholarship while also pursuing this work that really needs to be done as well. So it's really critical to keep this in mind when you are in those rooms and able to help make those decisions, that we can reframe what it means to be evaluated in general at an institution, in an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and can leverage this formal statements being made by academic administrators at this time to put action to the words that they have shared broadly.
Mm-hmm. There's another comment in the chat that says, COVID-19 is not the problem per se, systemic racism has to be addressed. And I think that that's really, really important to remember as we're doing this work.
And I know we're working on transitioning to a wrap up, but I think this is a really great comment, very relevant overall to the question. Someone asked how to, and this is the entirety, someone asked how to gather feedback from minoritized faculty without taxing their time and energy or making them vulnerable for coming forward in a public manner. I was going to comment that this is where empowered and capable DEI leadership or offices can be helpful. These can serve as a safe and as needed contact points for faculty from minoritized identities. It's important that these DEI representatives are in equal footing with other leadership and have ability to bring concerns forward and have them addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw that a few more links have been shared. We'll definitely get those back out, including from the Declaration of Research Assessment, where they published 5 design principles to improve policies and practices for hiring, promotion, and tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll do one last call for raised hands. Before we wrap it up, we'll give about a minute or two just to see if anyone else wants to chime in. And otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap things up.
Great, here we go. Kristen, thank you. Kristen, are you with us? If you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Hi, can I be heard?
There we go. Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies. I switched headsets in the middle. Just have a really quick question as to whether people have policies or resources they're sharing with faculty members to encourage them to be more inclusive in their responses to student issues that are occurring during this COVID crisis. Because some people are being rather rigid, and so I'm worried about that aspect of inclusivity and supporting students. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know that there were a number of resources that were shared as part of the coffee tea hours that the AIM network was hosting around additional student support, and we'll make sure that we share those as well. But I'm really curious as well if anyone else among our attendees has anything that they'd recommend in response to Kristen's question. Oh, good. We have another hand raised. Here we go. Peony, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So in response to Kristen's question, by the way, I'm Peony Fagan. I'm Associate Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. And one thing that we did is we created a short document of guidelines and principles that we disseminated to faculty and staff who are teaching, and asked them to abide by the principles and guidelines that articulated aspects or dimensions to not only inclusive teaching, but the kind of teaching that's necessary under these circumstances. And there were 5 or 6 principles that we developed with clear explanations, and then provided an opportunity for faculty to join in a conversation and discussion about how they may apply those principles to their work with students. So there's an opportunity to engage in discussion about them. And while it's not codified as policy, it was impressed upon them by the provost that there was an expectation they would incorporate these principles in their teaching.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, thank you, Kristen, for pointing that out. Peony, do you happen to have access to that document that we could share? Is it something that is allowable to disseminate to the community? Great, thank you, Peony. Perfect. We have one more hand raise. Catherine, thank you for joining us.
So I'm at the National Science Foundation, but my previous institution, California State University, Fullerton, they negotiated changing the grading scale for the spring semester so that students could elect to take a pass, no pass grade instead of their letter grade. And they could do that after the grades were recorded. They had a deadline by which they had to make the decision. They also changed the cutoff from a C to a C minus for that pass, no pass grade. And they were going to put onto students transcripts some notation that this was a COVID semester. And so things were slightly different during this semester. So they pretty much very quickly made a bunch of decisions like that. And you know, there's union issues, academic senate issues, et cetera. And everybody worked together to make all that happen, and very quickly actually, and then to get the word out to the students.
That's great, thank you. Do you know in the work that you were doing there, I've heard questions coming in from across the community as to whether that would negatively impact accreditation or for undergraduate students who are applying for graduate school, where they have to have certain grade records for core courses. How did you handle that in this decision-making process?
The students were strongly advised to do that research themselves basically, or ask the right questions. So they were informed of that as a potential issue, but it was left to them to try to make the decision for themselves, because there's probably 30,000 students at that university. So there's no way that anybody else but the individual could make the final decision.
Great. I'm seeing some other comments here about Texas A&M doing the same thing, and students being strongly, at other institutions, students being strongly urged to make decisions in conjunction with support from their advisors. So, yeah.
And I think that the restrictions on dropping classes were also made less stringent. So there's usually a deadline after which the student has to have a very compelling reason to be able to drop a class. And those were lifted so that basically they assumed, automatically gave everybody COVID as one of the kinds of rationales that would allow dropping courses late into the semester, and they didn't have to go through the same paperwork that they would have had to have done otherwise. So they eased the process on all of that kind of thing. And I'm sure retroactively, if students petition to drop the semester on the basis of what happened, I think they probably will treat those a little bit less stringently than they typically would.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I think that that's our last set of comments and questions here, and ask it over to Liz Sheree to wrap us up.
Hi everybody, thank you for participating in today's town hall. We are continuing this conversation on Mendeley. You can see the directions for joining there. Just go to equityandstem.org/join. Mendeley is the ARC Network Resource Library and Social Networking Platform. So you'll be able to find lots of resources there. Additionally, the ARC Network would like to share the following 5 resources. Links will be in the chat. Number 1, Dr. Leslie Gonzalez and Dr. Kimberly Griffin's Handbook for Administrators, providing thoughtful suggestions with focus on equitable practices, entitled Supporting Faculty During and After COVID-19. Second, check out the website for continuing the conversation on gender equity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Third, Dr. Stephanie Goodwin and Dr. Beth Michnick's STEM Equity and Inclusion Uninterrupted is an op-ed published in Inside Higher Ed, highlighting how the pandemic will negatively impact the careers of women in STEM, particularly women of color. Fourth, fairplaygame.org provides players with an opportunity to take the perspective of Jamal Davis, a Black graduate student. I'm sorry, my screen just went a little blank. Interactions with other characters. During this game, players will experience racial bias as well as a virtual environment. Winning in fair play involves learning when and how to name biases. Fifth, Intersectionality Matters is a podcast hosted by Kimberly Crenshaw, originator of the term intersectionality and the African American Policy Forum. Also, keep an eye out for the emerging summer webinar series addressing the topics raised today. We will also curate and share out the resources identified today and submitted through the Town Hall feedback form soon. Thank you again for participating in today's Town Hall.
Thank you, everyone.